My golden child brother hired a private investigator to prove I was the family failure. For 40 years, that story had worked just fine. I was the asthmatic, depressed middle child who never lived up to his potential. The one who worked part-time at a comic book store. The one my parents whispered about at family dinners while bragging about my brother's successful car sales career. So when he decided to finally expose me, no one questioned it. What he didn't expect was that the investigator he paid $40,000 to ruin me documented everything instead, including the part where I'm worth $8 million. Here's what makes this hurt more than it should. I'm 40 years old and I got tired of being invisible. For decades, my parents celebrated my brother's mediocrity while dismissing my tech career as a phase. They worried about my dead-end job while I quietly worked as a CTO at a software company worth hundreds of millions. They assumed I was struggling while I built an investment portfolio that generates more passive income than my brother earns in a year. I never corrected them. I didn't need their approval. My brother, however, needed proof that I was beneath him. So he hired a private investigator. And that's when everything flipped. Because the 40-page report he ordered didn't just uncover my financial records, it also detailed his 3 drunk driving arrests, a domestic violence charge, tens of thousands in credit card debt, and IRS issues he'd spent years hiding from our parents. The golden boy who got everything is a convicted felon drowning in debt. The family disappointment who got nothing just bought his 3rd investment property with cash. And next Sunday, at dinner, I'm going to let his own private investigator report tell the truth about who failed, who lied, and who this family underestimated for 40 years. Because my brother thought hiring a private investigator would finally prove I was the problem. Let me explain how 40 years of being the family disappointment actually worked. Growing up, the hierarchy was simple. My brother was the golden child, charismatic, confident, everything my parents wanted in a firstborn son. My sister was the baby princess who could do no wrong, and I was the problem child in the middle. Not because I caused trouble, because I had asthma attacks that disrupted family plans, because I dealt with depression that made me quiet and withdrawn, because I preferred reading comics to playing sports, because I was different in ways my parents didn't understand and didn't want to accommodate. When my brother got his first job selling cars, our parents acted like he'd been appointed CEO of General Motors. They bragged to neighbors about his sales numbers. They repeated his monthly commissions at dinner like they were stock prices. Every promotion became a family celebration. When I started working part-time at a comic book store during college, they sighed and asked when I was going to find a real job. When I mentioned I was studying computer science, they nodded politely, waited for me to finish the sentence, and then redirected the conversation to my brother's latest sales milestone. That pattern never changed. His mediocre accomplishments got applause. My actual achievements got concern. I wasn't praised, I was managed, encouraged to be realistic, reminded not to aim too high. To them, I wasn't a child with potential. I was the sick kid who'd never amount to anything. What they never bothered to ask about was what I was actually building while they weren't paying attention. During my senior year of college, I landed an internship at a tech startup. While my family assumed I was just playing with computers, I was learning software development from engineers who would later cash out and retire before 40. I wasn't just keeping up, I was outperforming people with twice my experience. After graduation, that internship became a full-time role. That role turned into a senior position, then team lead. Within 5 years, I was named Chief Technology Officer. The startup I joined as an intern went public 3 years ago. My stock options alone were worth more than my parents' house. But I kept my part-time shifts at the comic store, not because I needed the money, but because it grounded me. It was something I loved that didn't come with expectations. While my family worried about my dead-end retail job, I was quietly making investment decisions most people never get the chance to consider. Property purchases, long-term stock positions, early crypto bets that paid off. I bought my first investment property in cash while my brother was still financing his used Honda Civic. I bought 2 more over the next few years. The rental income alone eventually surpassed most full-time salaries. My net worth crossed $8 million last year. I could retire tomorrow if I wanted. I could buy and sell the dealership where my brother worked. But to my family, I was still just the disappointment who worked at a comic store and lived modestly because that was all I could afford. They had no idea their failure son was worth more than all of them combined. 3 weeks ago, I got an alert on my phone that changed everything. I use credit monitoring services, something most people in tech do as basic security hygiene. Identity theft, unauthorized credit checks, data breaches. You stay aware of who's accessing your information and why. The alert was simple: unauthorized credit inquiry detected. That's not unusual. Sometimes banks run soft checks for pre-approved offers. Sometimes employers verify financials for security clearances. Usually, it's nothing. But this wasn't a bank or an employer. The inquiry came from Strategic Information Services, a name I didn't recognize. When I looked them up, they were a private investigation firm specializing in background checks, financial investigations, and what they called comprehensive personal assessments. Over the next few days, more alerts came in, different agencies, different types of checks. Someone wasn't just looking at my credit score. They were building a full profile. Bank account verifications, property ownership searches, employment confirmations, investment portfolio reviews. Someone was digging deep into my financial history. And that was the moment it stopped feeling like curiosity and started feeling like intent. This wasn't someone wondering how I was doing. This was someone trying to prove something. Someone who needed evidence that I was exactly who they'd always said I was. A failure hiding nothing of value. As a CTO, I know how to trace digital footprints. It's part of the job. So I started investigating the investigators. Every credit inquiry leaves a trail. Every background check creates records. And every private investigation firm leaves paper trails, billing systems, vendor logs, compliance records that can be cross-referenced if you understand how these companies actually operate. My girlfriend Ava helped. Cybersecurity is her specialty, and she has access to databases most people don't even know exist. It took us 48 hours to find the source. A contract dated 2 weeks earlier, a payment authorization for a comprehensive background investigation and financial assessment. The same brother who'd spent years telling our parents I was barely getting by. The signature at the bottom made my blood run cold. The contract was signed by my own brother. When I confirmed my brother had hired someone to investigate me, I made a decision. If he wanted to play detective, I was done playing defense. Ava and I spent the weekend running our own investigation. Nothing illegal. We stayed strictly within public records and lawful databases. Court documents, credit reports, property filings, employment history, tax liens, everything anyone is allowed to see if they know where to look. If he's paying money to dig up dirt on you, Ava said, scrolling through database after database, it's usually because he needs you to look worse than him. She was right. People who are actually secure don't hire private investigators to prove their siblings are failures. They don't obsess over appearances. They don't need external validation. My brother was acting like someone with something to hide. And it turned out he was hiding a lot. The first red flag was his address history. 6 moves in 5 years, not promotions, not upgrades, evictions, lease violations, emergency relocations. Then we found the criminal record. 3 DWI arrests over 7 years. The most recent 18 months ago. Court-mandated alcohol counseling, community service, a suspended license. Then came the domestic violence charge. Filed by an ex-girlfriend 2 years earlier. Temporary restraining order granted, mandatory anger management classes, resolved through a plea agreement, and that still wasn't the worst part. His credit report read like a slow-motion collapse. $43,000 in maxed-out credit cards, medical debt in collections, multiple late payment flags, IRS tax liens. The golden child my family praised wasn't just struggling. He was a convicted felon drowning in debt. What hit me hardest wasn't the arrests or the money, it was realizing how much of this my parents already knew. I started cross-referencing dates. His second DWI lined up with the family dinner he skipped due to work obligations. The domestic violence charge was filed the same week my parents suddenly decided to help him with some unexpected expenses. Every crisis had been quietly managed. Bail money, lawyer fees, character letters. My father had even written to the court describing my brother as a hard-working family man experiencing temporary setbacks. Phone records showed repeated calls between my parents and his attorneys. Bank statements confirmed payments to legal defense firms. Property filings showed my parents had co-signed loans twice to keep him out of foreclosure. They hadn't just known, they'd protected him. They'd cleaned up his messes while calling me the disappointment, while warning me to be realistic, while treating my stability like failure and his chaos like potential. By Sunday night, I had everything laid out. Not opinions, not suspicions, facts. And I knew exactly where this was going. Because my brother didn't hire a private investigator to learn the truth. He hired one because he thought the truth would save him. 2 days later, the private investigator's report landed in my brother's hands. I know because his behavior changed overnight. Ava didn't need to intercept anything private. His reactions spilled into public view. Sudden social media silence, missed shifts at the dealership, a string of frantic calls to people he normally ignored. Panic doesn't stay quiet for long. The report was exhaustive. 40 pages, every asset documented, bank accounts showing 7 figures, property deeds for 3 investment properties, brokerage statements, my CTO compensation and equity position. 8 years of financial growth laid out in clinical, professional language on official letterhead. Everything my family had never bothered to ask about was now preserved in a legally defensible document. The investigation meant to expose me as a fraud had accidentally created the most thorough proof of my success. My brother didn't celebrate. He panicked. First, he called the investigator demanding clarification. Were they sure about the numbers? Could there have been a mix-up? Maybe outdated data? When the investigator confirmed the findings, my brother shifted tactics. He asked if the report could be adjusted. Not falsified, just reframed. More emphasis on my lifestyle. My part-time job at the comic store, my modest apartment, anything that made the numbers feel less real. The investigator refused. Facts were facts. That's when my brother made his worst mistake. He started calling family members. He warned my sister that the report might contain errors. He told my parents I might try to inflate my situation. He suggested they shouldn't believe everything if I suddenly started making claims about money. He was trying to discredit the truth before it reached them. Instead, he alerted them. For the first time in decades, my parents started asking questions. Why would a licensed investigator make errors? Why would someone exaggerate if a report already existed? And why was my brother so nervous about information he claimed was wrong? The assumption they'd relied on for 40 years, that I was struggling while he was thriving, suddenly felt unstable. They began noticing things they'd always ignored. My car, paid for in cash, my apartment, small but in a neighborhood that didn't match a comic store paycheck. My hobbies, vintage comics worth hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars each. The signs had always been there. They just hadn't cared enough to connect them. By Friday, my brother was unraveling. He called me directly for the first time in months. We need a family meeting, he said, skipping small talk entirely. This Sunday, everyone needs to be there. It's about what? About honesty, he said quickly. Real honesty, about work, about money, about who's actually contributing to this family and who's just coasting. He was trying to seize control one last time. Frame the truth as his initiative. Cast himself as the responsible one. Turn the spotlight back on me before the facts spoke for themselves. What he didn't realize was that he'd already lost. He'd paid for the evidence. And now he was handing me the perfect stage to let it speak. He wanted a family meeting to control the narrative. Instead, he had scheduled his own exposure. Saturday night, I sat at my desk with both reports open. His investigator's 40-page assessment of me, and the file Ava and I had built about him. The contrast was almost absurd. The private investigator had done meticulous work on my finances, asset verification across multiple sources, bank statements pulled from 3 institutions, property ownership confirmed through county records, stock portfolios cross-checked with brokerage filings, employment history validated through corporate disclosures, net worth $8.2 million, annual income, CTO salary, $485,000 excluding equity, passive income $127,000 annually from investments and rental properties, debt 0, credit score 847. It was 40 pages of calm, boring success, diversified income streams, long-term planning, stability, a life my family had never bothered to ask about, now documented in clinical, professional detail. Every assumption they'd made about me was dismantled line by line. But the more disturbing document was the one about my brother. His criminal record read like a timeline of escalating damage. First, DWI, 7 years ago, back .12, license suspended 6 months. Court-ordered alcohol education. Second DWI, 4 years ago, BAC .15, 18-month suspension. Community service, ignition interlock required. Third DWI, 18 months ago, BAC.18, classified as a repeat offender, 12-month jail sentence, suspended contingent on intensive outpatient treatment, 3-year license revocation. Between the second and third arrests came the domestic violence charge. Filed by his then-girlfriend, Rebecca Martinez, police reports documented visible bruising, emergency protective order issued, followed by a permanent restraining order after the hearing. The golden child my parents praised had been arrested 4 times in 7 years. 3 drunk driving arrests they'd hidden from everyone. The financial records were just as damning. While I'd been building wealth, he'd been dismantling his credit. 7 maxed-out credit cards totaling $43,847, all with late payments. $12,394 in medical debt sent to collections. $8,200 in IRS tax liens from unpaid obligations in 2019 and 2021, with garnishment orders against dealership commissions. Evicted in 2022 for non-payment. Current lease co-signed by our parents. Car loan 67 days delinquent. Repossession notice issued and quietly resolved through family intervention. The pattern was unmistakable. Every crisis triggered a rescue. Every arrest came with bail money, letters to judges, and "he's a good boy" explanations. Every failure was managed behind the scenes. And every time I succeeded without them, it was treated as proof I wasn't trying hard enough. The golden child owed more money than he'd ever earned. But there was one more layer my brother didn't account for. Digital records. Nothing illegal, nothing hacked, just data trails that exist whether people like them or not. Court scheduling systems showed my parents attending his hearings. Bank transfers aligned perfectly with legal defense payments. Insurance claims matched DWI accident dates. Phone logs showed calls to his dealership on days he missed work due to court obligations. Even email metadata, publicly accessible through compliance records, showed coordination between my parents and his probation officer. The cover-up wasn't emotional, it was administrative. They hadn't just enabled him, they'd actively managed his destruction while calling me the disappointment. By midnight, everything was organized, indexed, labeled. 40 pages proving my stability, dozens of documents proving his chaos, years of data exposing exactly who this family protected and who they ignored. Sunday dinner wasn't going to be dramatic. I wasn't planning a speech, I wasn't rehearsing lines. I was going to let evidence do what it always does when no one can interrupt it. My brother hired a private investigator to expose me. Instead, he handed me the tools to expose 40 years of family lies. And tomorrow, everyone was finally going to see what a real investigation looks like. Sunday morning, I had a choice to make. I could walk into that family dinner and let my brother control the narrative, frame the conversation around honesty, position himself as the successful one, and force me into defending myself against 40 years of assumptions. Or I could do what I do professionally. Let the data speak. In tech, we don't argue opinions, we don't debate who feels more convincing, we present evidence, verify sources, and let facts determine outcomes. My family had operated on assumptions for 4 decades. They decided I was the failure based on appearances and convenience. They decided my brother was the success based on charisma and their own denial. They had never bothered to test either conclusion. Now someone had. Professionally, thoroughly, with documentation. The question wasn't whether to use the information. It was how much truth this family could absorb in a single conversation. There would be consequences. My parents would have to confront 40 years of favoritism and accept that the son they'd protected was a criminal draining their resources, while the one they worried about had quietly built real stability. My sister would be forced to re-examine the hierarchy she'd grown up believing in. And my brother would lose the only leverage he'd ever had over me, our parents' approval. I would lose something too. Any remaining illusion that we could ever have a normal family relationship. But I'd stop chasing their approval somewhere around the second $1 million. Some relationships aren't worth preserving once you see the cost of maintaining them. Ava and I had talked about it Friday night. You don't owe them the relationship, she said. Family isn't automatic. It's something people earn by how they treat you. She was right. They'd had 40 years to know who I was. They'd chosen not to look. One dinner wasn't going to change that pattern. But it could end it. At noon, I printed 3 complete sets. The private investigator's report about me, the criminal and financial records on my brother, the side-by-side comparisons, the timeline showing years of cover-ups and selective blindness. Each set went into a clean manila folder, labeled, organized, professional. I wasn't going to that dinner to argue. I wasn't going to convince anyone. I was going to present findings. Like a board meeting, like a performance review, if they wanted honesty, they were about to get the fully documented version, legally verified, professionally sourced, and impossible to dismiss. Not my story, not my brother's story. The truth. Sunday dinner at my parents' house felt different the moment I walked in. My brother was already there, pacing in the living room with restless energy. My sister sat stiffly on the couch, clearly confused about why she'd been summoned. My parents moved around the dining room with the tense efficiency of people bracing for something unpleasant. "Good," my brother said as soon as I arrived. "Everyone's here. We can finally clear the air." "Clear what air?" my sister asked. "Some long overdue honesty," he replied, eyes fixed on me, "about who's actually contributing to this family and who's been pretending." I didn't respond. The manila folders stayed in my car. I wanted to hear how far he planned to take this. Dinner began awkwardly. My brother controlled the conversation, talking about responsibility, work ethic, and realism. He framed his car sales job like a financial empire, dropping numbers and anecdotes meant to sound impressive. My parents nodded along. My sister barely ate. Everyone was waiting for him to expose me. 20 minutes in, he finally set down his fork. "I think we need to stop enabling fantasy in this family," he said carefully. "We've all heard claims about success, about secret careers, and I think it's time we dealt with reality instead of stories." My parents exchanged uneasy glances. "I've done some professional research," he continued. "Background checks, financial verification, the kind that separates what people say from what can actually be proven." My sister stared at him. "You investigated him?" "I verified information," he snapped, because I was tired of hearing about comic book store employees pretending to be tech executives. He turned fully toward me. "So let's stop lying. Let's stop pretending retail work is some cover story. Let's be honest." That was when I spoke. "You're right," I said calmly. "Let's be honest." I stood, walked out to my car, and came back with the folders. The room shifted the moment I set them on the table. "Since you hired a private investigator," I said, sliding the first folder toward my parents, "I assumed you'd want to see what they actually found." I handed the second to my sister and kept the third. "The report you commissioned documents my net worth at $8.2 million, I continued evenly. "Annual income of $485,000 from my CTO position, approximately $127,000 in passive income." My brother went pale. "It also verifies ownership of 3 rental properties, a stock portfolio worth about $2 million, and 0 debt." I opened my own folder. "But since we're discussing professional investigations, I thought I'd share some research of my own." I placed the first document on the table. 3 DWI arrests over 7 years. The most recent 18 months ago. Blood alcohol content 0.18. My mother inhaled sharply. "A domestic violence charge filed in 2022, I continued, "resulting in a permanent restraining order." My father reached for the papers, hands shaking slightly. $43,000 in credit card debt, $12,000 in medical bills sent to collections. IRS tax liens totaling over $8,000. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't rush. Court records show mom and dad have paid approximately $67,000 in bail, legal fees, and co-signing arrangements over the past 5 years. Silence. The kind that presses against your ears. My parents stared at the documents spread across the table. Police reports, court filings, bank statements showing their payments. My sister flipped through the investigator's report about me, her expression changing with every page. My brother tried to speak, failed, tried again. Those are private records," he finally said. "So were mine," I replied, "until you paid someone to dig them up." My father looked up from a DWI report. "You've been arrested 3 times? My brother's voice cracked. "This is exactly why I did the investigation. He's trying to distract you from his lies by attacking me." "With court documents?" my mother asked quietly, holding the restraining order. "And you knew," I said, looking at them. "You covered for him, paid for it, while telling me to be more realistic about my career." My sister set the report down. "You're actually worth $8 million? She asked. "According to the investigator he hired." No one spoke. For the first time in 40 years, there was no golden child. No disappointment, just the truth laid out in black and white. My brother left first. Not with shouting, not with excuses. He looked at the papers scattered across the table, looked at our parents reading about arrests they'd helped cover up, and quietly walked out. The golden child didn't explode, he simply vanished. My parents sat in stunned silence for nearly 20 minutes, reading police reports, reviewing financial records, watching 40 years of assumptions collapse in real time. We had no idea, my mother finally whispered, holding the private investigator's report that detailed my net worth. You never asked, I said, about either of us. My father set down a court document. We thought we were protecting him. You were enabling him, I replied calmly, while criticizing me for not needing protection. That was the moment something shifted. Not guilt, not regret, authority. They were no longer the judges in the room. My sister spoke for the first time. I owe you an apology. We all do. Apologies don't undo 40 years, I said, but acknowledging the truth matters. The conversation that followed wasn't emotional, it was practical. Boundaries, expectations, what kind of relationship, if any, was possible going forward. 6 months later, my family looks different. My parents and I speak once a month. Polite conversations, no career advice, no comparisons, no attempts to manage my life. My sister and I meet for coffee occasionally. She asks real questions now, listens to the answers, we're rebuilding slowly without illusions. My brother moved across the country. No contact, no family safety net. For the first time, his life is his responsibility alone. And I'm at peace. Ava and I bought a house together, a quiet one, space for my comics, space for her cybersecurity lab. We host dinners with people who don't rank success, who simply respect it. I still work part-time at the comic shop, still build technology, still invest carefully, but I do it without needing anyone's approval. The greatest reward wasn't the $8 million they finally discovered. It was the freedom of no longer being underestimated and no longer caring who once did.